our topic is higher education at the 21st century, and we're fortunate to have with us Dr. E. Kelly Sanford, Dr. Sanford of Tennessee State University. And of course, Dr. Sanford, we mentioned earlier during this first segment that we wanted you to talk about some other aspects of higher education. I think that you've already laid the foundation by noting how very, very important higher education is in the 21st century, and it will be in the 21st century. Let's have you to sort of pick up and in a real sense to deal with this real issue that since this is the 50th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education, that has to do with the so-called gap in higher education between various groups and et cetera. Let's talk about it from that perspective.
Yeah, and that's a very important issue to discuss. When you think in terms of the gap that we have between, say, African Americans and European Americans graduating from high school, taking the standardized tests, there's still this gap between success in those test scores and those who are entering into institutions of higher learning. And the question becomes why? We must never forget of 244 years of African enslavement, 81 years of Jim Crow laws, leading into a very devastating 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson that made everything separate and so-called equal, but as we may very well know, it was quite unequal. And as a result of that, that legacy of those hundreds of years of being enslaved, not allowing human beings to have the opportunity to have equal access to education. We're talking about the fundamentals, the alphabets of learning, of just reading.
Literacy.
And literacy. And then leading into a policy that was supported by our Supreme Court in 1896 that said that things still should be separate and of course they were unequal. That then led into years after that into 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education. That was indeed the first time that school systems were supposed to have become desegregated. I myself, as you asked about my biography, was born 8 years after the Brown decision and went 7 to 8 years into a segregated school system myself in North Carolina. So when you think in terms of this gap, there has to be some idea, some notion, if you will, about that legacy that has persisted for such a long time and still continues today when you think in terms of discrimination and racism. So that causes this gap when we think about it in a real sense, and we have to give some very strong consideration to that as far as higher education is concerned. And if we can consider that, I think we can make some breakthroughs, if you will, into closing that gap within scores on the SATs, within the certain types of classes that students might take to prepare them for higher education, but more so than anything else, as far as parents' involvement in understanding that legacy as well. Dr. John Ogbu, a noted social psychologist, speaks in terms of how we need to be familiar with this phenomenon, particularly within the African American community, so that we can bridge that gap between that legacy of what has happened in the past and then try to bridge it into doing better in the 21st century.
Dr. Sanford, you know that people have talked about this gap and they've talked about essentially this legacy that you're talking about. Now, there seems to be an impression among some people that it is wrong in a real sense to talk about this legacy because they believe that this, to speak of this legacy about the denial of opportunities and et cetera, by African Americans, that this seems to undermine any kind of integration between the races and et cetera. Speak to that issue of dealing with education.
Okay. Well, there are two pieces that I would like to just cite. Dr. Gordon Allport, in his classic piece entitled The Nature of Prejudice, he indicates in there that we have to understand this legacy, this history, in order for us to come to the table and have a true dialogue about it. Dr. Alan Johnson, another sociologist, has a book entitled Privilege, Power, and Difference, where he also reiterates that whole phenomenon, how we have to understand what has occurred in the past. We have to be familiar with the terms, the legacy of the past in order to be able to move forth in a very positive way. We can't act as if we are oblivious to what happened in the past and everything out of osmosis is just going to get better and everything is just going to be real smooth for the 21st century in higher education. So by understanding it, I think educators can come to grips with it. And that coming to grips with it means that we have to have a curriculum, some sensitivity to ethnic diversity, some sensitivity to how we should go about having classes. And that's why I think the historical African American University is still so important as we move into this 21st century, particularly places like Tennessee State University, Fisk University, you know, Jackson State University, North Carolina Central, Howard University, Lincoln University. All of these schools and many more still have this as a primary mission within their curriculum to try to help students to do better and prepare them, as we all know, for all levels of not only education but specializations.
You know, let's talk about these historical black colleges by giving our audience, before we have our second commercial break, 2 or 3 minutes, for some information relative to these institutions themselves and how these institutions came into being.
Okay, these are very important institutions, and as I gave you that legacy of enslavement, coming out of that when there were no schools, no institutions of higher education that were quote-unquote European American would allow people of African descent to attend them. So as a result of that, missionaries in many instances were very important in coming into the Deep South and understanding the importance of having institutions of higher learning there, started to found some of these institutions. For instance, right here in this particular state, Fisk University was founded in that way. And of course, the Jubilee Singers were very instrumental in trying to get resources and monies available so it could stay open, and many people went there. We can't have a true conversation about this until we talk about Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. And when he talks about the importance of education and how these institutions and their mission was there for African Americans to be able to become educated. And so they were there for that particular purpose because we lived in a society, again, that had created certain laws and bylaws, ways of being that always left people out. And these institutions were at the foundation of giving opportunity for people to do better. As I sit here, and a very good example of that is attending one of those institutions and finishing it.
Very good. And of course, when we come back, let's see if we can, and we've got about 50 seconds before our second commercial break. Let's see if we can pull all of this together by at least getting some kind of direction in terms of where we as a society ought to go in the 21st century dealing with higher education. Certainly, I think that if we've already contended that higher education is as important in the 21st century, perhaps as a secondary education might have been earlier, you see. There has to be a problem in terms of access, you see, and so I know that you've got quite a bit of information in reference to access, and so when we come back, we want you to talk about how do we make higher education available to a larger group of individuals in the 21st century. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. The topic is higher